We'll, for anyone who, let's see, well, yeah, this is all our regulars. So we got, for anyone following along on live stream, the sentence read, as creatures of the natural order, humans cannot escape the palette of subjective resources they've been endowed with. Ultimately, we think as we have habituated ourselves to think, which
Come here.
is just a great sentence, just a great sentence. And it comes into focus, after all of the time we spent on the earlier chapters and the earlier parts of this chapter. All of these loaded terms, creatures, natural, the order, the subjective resources. We talked about, habituation and the relationship between action and self-creation that's involved in that. There's an enormous amount here that deals with some of the nuances of the ancient perspective on free will versus determinism, as well as on what does it mean to be natural. So, so with that out of the way, the rest of the paragraph flows nicely. I thought we'd just dive in. Um, so he takes us to the Kafka story, America with the K. And for anyone following along at home, Kenneth Smith is a big Kafka fan, and he sees Kafka as being every bit as much a philosopher who's important to the existentialist tradition as Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Marx and Heraclitus and Arendt and the rest are. He usually throws Dostoevsky in there too, and sometimes Philip Rieff. So Kafka's America offered the notion that anyone could be an artist as the apparent singular lunacy of the new world, right? So he's talking about the way this is dealing with this issue of equality versus diversity, and how in modernity we want to pretend that everybody's equal. And the reason that we pretend everyone is equal is we say only, and we never think this part consciously, it's just in the entire structure of our political economy. Only if people are equal to ourselves are we willing to grant them basic human rights. If we detect any inequality, our obsessive reflex is to try to arrange ourselves into a hierarchy where we're above them. Because they're different from us, they're inferior to us. And therefore, we must oppress them. They have to work for us. And maybe we should exterminate them. And we've got a lot of genocide running through modernity, too. It's a major theme. The purification, the optimization, the meritocracy, all of these things are covers for the modern, what is the modern translation of the medieval concept of we can only achieve world peace if we exterminate all of the religions. If there's only one religion and it's ours by coincidence. So there's this idea that the natural impulse for us is to do away with all diversity. And so if anyone wants to survive, they'd better be identical to us. And if they're not identical, then they're not worthy of human rights. The ancients had this very different perspective. And the ancient perspective is a little schizoid, right? Because the ancient perspective, on the one hand, fully embraces the idea that the conquerors should dominate the conquered, right? That's the basis for the entire cycle of worldviews, of epochs that we're inhabiting. But the Greeks themselves had over time built up this rationalization of their class system in which they argued that, well, diversity isn't necessarily wrong. It's being different from me doesn't necessarily mean that I should, dominate you, but it does mean that we should optimize each other's education and roles in society to focus on the things that each of us is best at. This is based on that concept of arete, and that we need a lot of different kinds of people with a lot of different aretes in order to survive and succeed as a society. If we're all clones of each other, that means we all have the same weaknesses. It's like the problem with the banana. The first virus to come along wipes out the entire variety, as is happening right now. The banana we all grew up with is going to be gone in 10, 20, 30 years. It's gradually going extinct because it's a monoculture, and nature abhors a monoculture. So so there's this way in which we imagine that we are the most diverse, accepting civilization that has ever existed, and that we celebrate diversity. But the way we celebrate it is by calling it equality and arguing that we're all the same. And when you look at the way we educate people, again, we do it where we're sort of enforcing this homogeneity. Everyone has to pass the same tests. Everyone must measure up to exactly the same mark. And it's kind of, there are an enormous number of crazy ideas flow out of that. So Kafka's exploring that with this idea that everyone can be an artist. He's saying, well, there's a difference between everyone being able to express themselves, which is one definition of art, versus everybody being competent to develop mythos that can help to make us a healthy culture, which is a different definition of art. That's the ancient definition of art. And the two kinds of works are not equal to each other. They're not identical to each other. In fact, from the ancient perspective, they're opposites of each other. One of them is absolutely vital for society, and without it, civilization collapses. The other, is nice for decorating your house, I suppose, or for getting in touch with your feelings and figuring out who you are, or for exercising your capabilities and learning what you can and can't do. It's a completely different thing from the mission of trying to survive as a civilization, even though there's a tenuous relationship. So this is kind of the subject here. Sharon, you got your hand up, and go ahead and tell us what's on your mind.
I have a quick question. You said if we think they're equal to us, then they deserve basic rights. Did I understand that correctly?
This is the modern conception of equality and human rights, is that because we're all equal, therefore we all deserve the same rights. You can see it in the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. So my question is, where is the line between equality and humanity? How did the culture resolve that?
Yes. Well, and that question strikes right at the heart of the different conceptions of these different worldviews of these different epochs. They all answer that question differently. And there are some things in common because these three epochs are part of the same cycle of epochs, but there is an enormous amount of diversity in it. So, the challenge to the modern conception can be expressed with the question, well, if people deserve equal rights because they are equal to each other, what does that mean? What does that mean we're going to do when we come across somebody who's not our equal? How are we going to treat them then? And the answer is circular. Oh, everybody's equal to everybody else, no matter what. Now, as a lifelong fan of Martin Luther King Jr., I find the idea that Martin Luther King Jr. is equal to Jeffrey Dahmer, the Green River Killer. We've got a whole bunch of psychopaths that used to run around in the Northwest murdering people. And I don't think that they and Martin Luther King Jr. are equal. I mean, I think their character is broken and unhealthy and sick. And I think Martin Luther King Jr.'s character is fantastic. It's like, it may not be perfect, but he's fantastic and he's a model for people. And the idea that we're going to erase those distinctions and pretend that they don't matter is insane to me. I mean, it's a kind of madness.
So let me ask you this, because I think a lot about this. Is equality a social construct like race? And we talk about higher beings and our creator. Our higher being has endowed us with our basic humanity. What makes us a human being? What makes us as a human being different from a dog, different from a snake, right? So humanity, is that a social construct?
Certainly the ancients, the medievals, and the moderns each think of humanity as something very, very different. And in some ways, diametrically opposed to each other. The ancient conception of what it means to be a person is radically different from the medieval conception of what it means to be a person. And likewise, both of them are radically different from what it means from a modern perspective to be a person. So from that perspective, yeah, there's a I think of it like this. I've been working on, I think I've mentioned before, I've been working on a notation system for existentialist philosophy, a vocabulary and notation system to supplement these courses with. And they're partly inspired by Kenneth Smith's writing, partly by Hegel, partly by Heraclitus, and so on. And in it, the very first distinction that has to be drawn is between how things actually are and what we might call actuality. Kenneth Smith uses that phrase very, very precisely, versus what seems real to us from our human perspective, from our acculturated perspective within a specific epoch. That is, each of us mentally inhabits a reality that's persuasive to us and that we believe is identical to how things actually are. And in that belief, we're failing the very first test of what it means to be human, which is we're getting confused about the difference between what's out there and what's in here. We think that what's in here is defining what's out there. If it seems that way to me, then ipso facto, our ego concludes that must be the way things actually are. We're not willing, and this is particularly intense in the modern epoch, although it hasn't been something we've ever been really good at. We're not fully willing to admit that as finite beings, our capacity to represent what's actually true in an infinite cosmos cannot possibly be fully accurate or even close enough. You can't, it's like trying to fit a globe onto a flat map. You're going to distort something. When you try to map infinity into a finite mind, you're going to have massive distortions. So when you ask this question about, what does it mean to be human, there are at least two answers. And one answer is, well, what does it actually mean to be human? And the other is, what do we think it means to be human? And sort of we inhabit both of those. This is the core of the human condition. We inhabit both of those realities at the same time. This is the Heraclitean idea that Homo sapiens is an amphibian who swims in two worlds. There's the infinite cosmos, the infinite nature around us, and then there's the infinite nature within us. And the infinite nature within us is projecting a picture of what it thinks the infinite cosmos around us looks like, which is not the same as that cosmos. And that projection, that not only applies to things we look around us at, like a tree, or the weather, but it also applies when we look in the mirror. What do we see? Well, there's the actual person, and then there's what we project from our acculturated consciousness. So I'm basically saying you asked a simple, straightforward, very important question, but the answer is a paradox.
But the concept of equality, upon which our derivation of character and class is based, right, has the same kind of questioning.
It does. It does. So, there's Thomas Jefferson writing, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and happiness. And meanwhile, at home, he's got slaves. He's not letting them have liberty or happiness. And he's really, the way he treats them is shortening their life and their health span. And he has no problem with this direction in his own mind between what the rights of man and the rights that he allows to the people that he believes that he owns. And this kind of confusion about, well, do we actually mean what we say? Do we mean what we think? It's pretty much rife throughout the modern world. Another example is, have you heard of the tree that owns itself? It's a legal case. And it's somewhere in the United States. And I think it's in the South, where they arranged things legally so that there is this one tree in this one town that legally owns itself. And because it owns itself, unlike any other tree in America, this tree has actual legal rights. Normally, trees under modernism are treated as garbage, as disposable waste, as resources to be used up however we see fit with no rights of their own, not unlike the way we used to see slaves. But this one tree has been given legal standing, and so it can't be cut down, and its space around its roots can't be infringed upon, because unlike every other tree, the law acknowledges that this tree has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a person, it's a legal person, unlike all other trees. Now, what's weird about this is that genetically, trees are more than 90% identical to us, right? I mean, we're all made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, the same elements in roughly the same proportions. We're all based on DNA, RNA, and protein. Almost everything is the same. To an alien species, they might have some trouble distinguishing a human being from a tree because we're so much alike. And the fact that one of them stands still a lot and is green, is to us, it's a huge difference, but to an alien, that would be a very minor difference. But despite the fact that we are nearly equal, we don't invest a tree with not only the same rights, but really any rights. Whereas we give human beings, this framework of rights. So why am I stressing this? The question is, the relationship between recognizing the equality of others and granting rights is something that we have failed at, not only when it comes to things that are nearly the same as us, like other living beings, which under indigenous culture are considered to be at least our equals and maybe our superiors, but we also fail with each other and look for any minor difference we can find between human beings and say, aha, I have seized upon a difference that now justifies, I can now slaughter you all, or I can possess you all, or I can take all your stuff. Like the Pope said, I can't remember, 1400s, 1500s, the doctrine of discovery, right? He says if Europeans come across non-Christians anywhere in the world, because they don't recognize the Christian God, they don't have to be treated as human beings. So you could just take all their stuff, all of it, because they're not our equals. This issue of equality and rights has been just a major issue for us. And the way that we've resolved it over the centuries, increasingly, in sort of a direction as we moved into late modernity, is we have decided, just like we created the legal fiction, that this one tree that owns itself is a person. And only after that do we grant it rights. We've created another legal fiction. And that legal fiction is that all people are equal. And if they're equal, well, then reluctantly we suppose that we're not allowed to, enslave and murder each other, I guess. Is sort of that's the foundation on which the international framework of human rights is standing, is a legal fiction. And the artificiality of that, first of all, in the fact that, I've been meeting people my whole life and I've never met two people who are the same. I mean, really at all. So, first of all, it's based on a falsehood. But second of all, the fact that we need to have legal protection against our epoch's otherwise pronounced and well evidenced tendency to treat each other abominably, if we can find any excuse to do it. It's like, rather than deciding to be good people, we've agreed that we'll be evil people, except in this one special circumstance. And then we legally mandated that special circumstance applies to everybody to try to stop ourselves from behaving badly. Is this a sane framework for how to treat other people? This question of, are we equal or not equal, is really tangled up in these complicated questions. And this is what Kafka's getting at, this from the perspective of, is everybody an artist? Does everybody count as an artist? And so now we'll go to the questions, beginning with the artist. Hi, Phil.
Hi, yeah, I want to say something, but before you get to that, you can grant anything a right, but it's under a capitalist structure. In other words, I could buy a slave, I could buy a forest, and I could declare, don't trespass on my property and don't cut down my trees because I've given them the right to exist. So, so in that sense, you could subvert it by, in a sense, but you can only subvert it under a capital structure. So that's the problem with that. In other words, they don't really have rights. They only have rights because I granted it to them by purchasing them to begin with. So,
right.
So that's not the main point. I just want to point out that you can give trees rights, but you have to come up with a lot of money and go down to Brazil and buy up acres and acres of land. The thing I wanted to say in that regard was what struck me as unfolding this, and I couldn't find it for some reason. I think it's a paragraph above when he's talking about a fate and telos. You could find that thing, right? Right away when I saw that, it seems to be talking about the relationship, first of all, between the outer and the inner. Okay, I guess at one point, like fate, somehow, some external force is pushing you around. You're destined to do this. And telos seem to be reside in the interior. In other words, you have control over it in the sense that it is really belongs to you. I think then it becomes a question of how you interpret telos. Like, and it seems to me that that's where the archive comes in, I think. And I think that's the difference between Plato and Aristotle. I mean, Plato see that telos, I guess, is a conceptual mental thing that you have constructed as a structure that in a sense you could impose on yourself and in a sense maybe on society. And that's kind of the human telos, I suppose. Whereas Aristotle seemed to think it's a kind of life force that all living beings, I'm not sure if he extended to planets, but all living beings have this structure that's inside that unfolds in the telos.
He extends it to plants.
That's right, extends to the plants. And and so therefore human beings have these telos, and so there's that telos is not as great of a separation between uh I guess the mind and ideas and in a sense the living spirit, and which means that just human beings have a higher consciousness of the telos because it's not a carrot. Carrots has it, but but it's but it's very restricted. Whereas human beings have a higher consciousness of this inner soul, inner spirit, but it's not separated from life in the sense that there's two different worlds. There seems to be a connection between them. That's how I saw it. And in some sense, there there's not the degree of what we now call the ontological difference between uh, thinking and being. And it was I think Plato tended to put it in a more abstract way in the forms is what controls us. And it's so there's kind of a division between uh life, I mean being in a sense, and thinking, and which is a separate element that's internal but external to the world itself. And I think that's the difference, and I kind of equivocate between them because I kind of like both ways of thinking, but in some sense, there there does seem to be something a little bit missing in Plato in the sense that that's why he thinks the forms are far superior than a than the appearance of things, because because I don't know if Plato puts as much. I don't know. I can't say that. I just don't. He doesn't seem to talk about it as much as like that. Other living things also have this sort of spirit. This life force within them, which is the driving force. So that does the telos does contain the mind, and does the mind, in a sense, originate from this sort of natural spirit or living life force, or does it at some point the mind emerges and it begins to uh, order the life force around in a way? I don't
I'll be
know. I
drawing
mean, I'm
pictures about
asking a
this.
question. That seems like a very
Oh,
fundamental question.
it is. I'm going to be making diagrams about this. I mean, this is we're dealing with so many moving parts here. The what is the role of the telos? What is the role of character? What is the role of archai and so forth? That you really need a picture. And That's what I'm working on putting together. That's part of why I'm doing the notation system.
Well,
Is
I think part of that might also mean that Aristotle doesn't probably has part of a line between philosophy and poetry, because I think he he must feel that poetry also have this telos in it. I mean, he certainly uh, was very moved by ancient theater. I mean, he apparently written a lot about it. So therefore, it was, and I doubt whether Plato even has that schism, as most people claim. The debate between the philosophy and poetry, and I think that might be too hard of a dividing line. I
yeah.
to think that Plato actually felt that way, because he certainly wrote his philosophy in a dialogue, and essentially in a play form. So I'm not sure whether we hardened up. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Whether that medievals did not harden that divided line, which he uh, didn't quite have. Uh, Although there was a divided line, I don't think it was as hard as we now think of it. It's like, one part and another part. So I'll just leave it there, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
No, I wasn't going to talk to Phil about Plato. I wanted to talk to Sharon because maybe things aren't so unusual. I mean, the Athenians for sure had strong concept of aristocracy, but they also had isonomia, equal law. They didn't say, maybe they didn't say everybody's the same, but they said the same law for everybody. You kind of flip it and it produces a sort of equality of citizenship. So I don't know. I sometimes think Rick's more puzzled by the Declaration than he needs to be. I think that sentence, the opening from the preamble, the big point there is that it's not our government that's granting these things, not like in Europe. Your rights as a citizen don't come from the king. Now, maybe we have to, as Phil has said in the past when he talks about sort of hermeneutics, we bracket our creator, that we don't know what our who or what our creator is and how he did it, but we accept politically that's the source of our rights. That is, our government can't take them because they didn't give them. And the same thing, and I would say after that, we get quite easily to isonomia, and we don't get forced to, I don't know, some idea of, I don't know, equality and sameness. Equality in some characteristics is not the same as everybody being the same. And we don't need everybody to be the same. And you've taught me a lot, Sharon, about difference. You're far more observing of people's individuality. If anything, I'm the one that casually clumps people together. But well, that's
so Donald. Let me just interrupt here for a second, if I may. So is life that we're endowed by our Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Is that humanity?
well, I don't know if
we mean by humanity. Or is that equality and rights? You see, I'm trying to resolve this because we're in this big section about character and class. And those two big issues are the way in which we treat each other, I think.
Well, you may be asking a question that I can't answer, and I may not answer it because I can't. But I don't think that statement is particularly metaphysical.
Oh.
Except that, I mean, it's basically saying, okay, there's this stuff. We may not know its true origin or our true origin or anything like that, but they don't come from our government.
Mm.
And therefore, you know, I know you know these things, but it's a common misunderstanding. Well, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a misunderstanding. People in the United States say rights come from our government. But if you read the documents, powers go from the people, which independently have those from their creator, however we want to bracket our creator in our hermeneutics, to become delegated powers to our government.
Yes.
And as when I lived in France, as they pointed out, when we overthrew the king, we were not so foolish as to have the new government give up the powers and rights of the king. And as a French citizen, we do get those rights from the government. Now, I don't know about England or Germany or others, but from there, you know, that the whole conceptual framework for the government are reversed compared to us, to the United States legal system. So I'm wandering now, but the point was simply that this same kind of contradiction between people being different and equal before the law is not new to us because of our Declaration of Independence. When Athens wasn't under tyranny, which it was at several points, the restoration of normal democracy required isonomia, that the same law applied to all people. There weren't laws by class. There were laws for everybody. Same law, isonomia. You know, so even there are still aristocrats, but inheritance worked the same way, property ownership. It may be sort of cynical to think of it that way, because what do poor people care about inheriting? If you have nothing to inherit, same law may not comfort you. You know, it's that old say that the law keeps the rich and the poor from sleeping in the park at night. Well, the rich don't care about that because they don't sleep in the park at night anyway. But anyway, I don't think this is not a new issue that modernity has a problem with. That even the Greeks, when they sought to have democratic government, at least among the citizens, and we all have to remember that their citizen body was smaller, but they all operated under the same law. Well, enough. I'm wandering now. But I thought maybe I could help Sharon with this, but I should be more modest in what I think my abilities are.
I mean, that was a great point. I mean, that there's basically two issues that it's very easy to conflate. And one of the issues is, are people identical? And one issue is the law that applies to people identical? And you get very different results in a civilization depending on how you independently answer those two questions. So it's interesting that the Athenians would have this perspective that people are definitely not equal, but that the law that applies to them should be.
At least apply to the citizens.
Yeah.
They do, but it's also clear, I think, looking at medievals, that the I don't know what's a good word. I don't want to call it aristocracy, but the king and his court and all that, they operated under a different set of laws.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
You know, and the members of the clerisy operated, they were under different laws.
Yeah.
So you know,
Big
it
change.
doesn't have to be this small example from Athens and this large example from the United States. Being, we can find cases where neither paradigm holds.
Right.
Well,
Right. Thank you for that, Donald. I'm gonna spend a lot of time thinking, I think, about the distinction between isonomia and equality of people.
Mm.
These are interesting issues. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I of course watched a great deal of Star Trek and remember all those 1960s glorious moments when the rights of man and aliens are extolled, and the talk about some of the Earth tradition, the Magna Carta, and then all the rights were established in the Martian riots of whatever. And I just find these positions idealistic. We pick ideals. We live in a culture which supports certain ideals, and we become emotionally attached to them. For example, if I was in a different sort of culture, and, in this culture we have feminism, but in this other culture, we very carefully educated the young women to understand that their role in life is to serve men, obey, and not ask questions. We could train them very well, and 99% out of 100 will not ask any questions. There will always be that one bad penny, though. But and this question of slavery as well, you got to remember that if you go back to these older sorts of societies, they were built on a class system. And there were the people at the top, the landowners, and they were the people that counted. And then progressively you went down the scale, you had small landowners, and then down that you had landless men. And the role of landless men in society was going to be servile in whatever way, in whatever capacity. I was quite interested when I was reading about, the history of the Vikings. I was trying to compare the culture of these ancient Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Franks. And they were very similar. Now, I was interested to come across in the reference in the early 11th century. This was in the time between the transition between the pagans and the Christians, that Christianity was starting to become dominant, but a pagan chieftain seized power in Norway. But he had to respect the Christians. And he was trying to say, well, us pagans are just as moral as you Christians. And he said that unfortunately the laws on servitude have been overthrown. So it seems the pagans did have rules about slavery and servitude, but it seems their traditional value was if you were taken prisoner, you served so much time as a slave, but you had a right, if you behaved well, to obtain the status of freedom after so many years. And the chieftain that took over said, there are people that are engaging in permanent slavery, and that's against our laws. Now, of course, once you were freed as a virtual serf, it simply meant you could go and look for a new master once a year. Oh, I don't like this master. I'll go and try and find another. You could wander around the country and say, try and find a better deal. You're a free man in that sense, which was a bit of a limited freedom. But what I am going to say is I find a lot of idealism, well, it's like there's this big ruler in the sky and we can measure what a value is. And I keep on telling the people that a lot of our measurements, social measurements, are arbitrary. I remember the syndicalist idea that Rudolf Steiner extolled. He separated matter, the economy, from the social political realm and then the cultural spiritual realm. And yes, we have all these rules that belong to the social realm. We live in a certain sort of society with certain sorts of traditions. But it's a mistake to think that there's some absolute spiritual value in a social arrangement. Now, that was a habit of the Christians. They had the all-powerful Lord God above them who made the rules, and our priests told us the rules. But of course, once we've tossed God out of the picture, well, who's making the rules then? Humans? Oh, I'm a human. Who's to say any other human is better than me? I'll make my own rules. My rules are just as good. I'm a human. I can make rules too. That's a warning. This is a warning Nietzsche made. And the more I look at it, I see the greater significance of it. The Christians, you had this religious tradition, as a God. You've thrown it out of the formula, as Nietzsche pointed out. And his fellow atheist academics are all standing around thinking, oh, we're looking pretty, aren't we? And Nietzsche says, no, watch out, guys. You don't know what's coming along. I think it comes down to Hume here. I'm a bit wary of idealism. And of course, famously, Albert Ellis took up Hume's is and ought. And Albert Ellis would warn us, it's nice if everybody's nice to each other, but is that a should or an ought? We create oughts. Oughts are a social arrangement. Now, when it comes to the question of murder, well, really, that's a social tradition, probably based on the fact that 99.99 out of 100 don't like being killed. And people don't like their friends being killed. There's always going to be that one that has to be different and thinks the idea of being killed is really great. But I mean, I imagine even on the most rudimentary level, if you try and grab a guy and push his head underwater, he's going to fight like hell. And it's not even going to be a deliberated thing like the rules around the American independence. It's an impulse. And of course, we add all sorts of ideas to it. Yeah, we want to live. I have grand ambitions. I want to go somewhere. This is all complex stuff. It's not that simple. And the sort of the idealistic simplification that goes on about it, we have to be a bit wary about. And this is why I explore philosophy, because I don't think the questions are that easy. I think there's a lot of stuff which is becoming dangerous in the world because there's people approaching matters from a very simple-minded frame of reference. And if you look at some of these guys that were ruling these Greek kingdoms, the aristocrats, they were a bit more aware of these issues. But of course, the sort of people we're electing to power today, one wonders, do they have a classical education? No. So yeah, it's a lot of complex issues. But yeah, I've learnt that Albert Ellis technique, and it's what Hume said. Yeah, it'd be nice if everybody was equal, but it's not necessarily a natural fact or a fact of reality. And people don't go over these issues. And this is a heavy work you have to do in philosophy. And after a few years of it, it's painful. It's not easy. I start to wonder what the individual really is. Am I really this thing, or am I just a process? Am I really just a product of things I don't understand, which has to be true because I'm the product of organic drives I don't really have a full comprehension of. But yeah, I'm wary of idealism because what happens when you come across a tribe of cannibals and they said we were hungry, so this guy, we didn't like him too much, so we clubbed him over the head and ate him. That's perfectly normal to them. Is
Yes.
that human or inhuman? Well, no. If I was living as a, troglodyte, perfectly normal behavior, perhaps. It's our values are social. We've got to be wary of thinking that our values are the truth of the universe. They're just based on tradition, our organic being. Like I said, generally we don't like being killed. We don't like being mistreated. We don't like being screamed at. And that becomes a social condition. Oh, well, I think I've meandered a bit all over the place. I don't like doing that, but thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
It's a process, Stephen.
Yeah, we're figuring it out. Still, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I have two things to say. First, a brief, not a criticism, Donald, of what you said about the park, but perhaps a diversion or maybe even a misdirection. Uh no, the rich is not afraid of not living and sleeping in the park, and you got that part correct. But everybody is free to live in the park. They just have to have the money to buy the damn park. It's your damn fault that you didn't have the money because you could be sleeping in the park now and nobody will bother you. So that's the capital structure we lived in, you know. So that's a brief misdirection. Not that I disagree with you, but it's true. Now I want to get to a more serious question that Stephen brought up, which is quite serious. It came to mind when I was, I think last week in the existential meeting, we're talking about Baidu. Uh, and somehow it came up that, Heidegger, as much of a existentialist and in a way an atheist as he was, he made this strange statement like, in the world as it is, only God could save us now. And of course, his friends who really loved him say, what are you doing? What are you saying? You're calling God. And it's hard to know whether that was just a kind of throwaway nostalgia, like, God, like we existentialists can figure this out. So it came up to the thing, and then somebody asked, Heidegger talks a lot about death, driving to death and all that. But how come he doesn't say anything about birth? I mean, it's like, and the reason is, I think he's talking about being thrown into the world. And I defended him about being thrown in the world. each of us, we have no choice. We're thrown into a situation we are at, and we're trying to figure it out. Now, if we had the confidence that there's a God, then in a sense, no, we're not thrown into the world. God placed us there for some reason, okay? But if you live in a current condition when God is dead, well, at least to some people, there's a question about that. Then you're thrown into the world. You have to figure it out on your own in some sense. In some sense, what humanity is finally, I guess, grown up in a sense that we're going to take the responsibility of figuring this thing out, even though we're not infinite beings. And so then I sort of talked about, yeah, the problem with the original creation is that I think they were all thrown, even the gods. You know, you take a look at the Egyptians. The primal Egyptian myth was in the beginning, there was a cosmic cow and a sea. And a little bit later, there was a desert wind. Okay. Seems like if you're a human being, you're thrown into that world. That's pretty ambiguous. There was no creator. You're in an existing situation. You look at the Greeks, you're living in the Olympian world, but they were a product of the Titans. And there were several generations, you know, you could say maybe originally Gaia was what, raped by the sun or something, and that produced the world. I mean, like, okay, the gods, the Olympians certainly were thrown into the world, in a sense. You take a look at the Chinese. The Tao that could be known is not the eternal Tao. The Tao that could be spoken is not the eternal Tao. So you're thrown into the Tao. You don't know what the hell it is, but it is real, you know. And I said, well, the Hindus, you know, the Vedic gods, there were three gods: the creator God, the sustainer God, Vishnu, and the destroyer God. It's a repetition that repeats, and you're thrown into this repetition of creation, sustainment, and destruction. That's what the cycle is. You're thrown into the world. And I said, well, even if you take a look at the Hebrew God, we say that, you know, God created things out of nothing. No, that's not true. In the beginning, God separated light from darkness. So there was a gray light, chaos, and he separated. So there was something before, and he was thrown into that thing. Is like, God, this is kind of murky. Let me separate light from darkness. And then when you get to the Christians, in the beginning was Logos, and Logos was with God, and Logos was God. And I'm thinking about that, like, that sounds like Christ. Christ was thrown, his body was thrown into the world, in a sense, to be in the world, to save us. Everybody's thrown. I said, maybe the closest thing we have is the Big Bang. You know, the infinite small, what is it, point element that banged up and created a world. And now that we have the James Webb Telescope, that is in doubt. Many, many scientists are saying that there was something maybe before the Big Bang, that maybe it was like a pulsating crunch and bang, a bouncing universe, a bouncing multiple verses. So our universe that we presently live in is thrown into this cycle of bouncing universes. So as a human being, you have to realize that you are thrown into a condition and you have the responsibility of figuring it out. Or you could pray to Yahweh to separate the light from the darkness from your mind, I suppose, and figure it out. So I think that's probably why, out of a kind of desperation and nostalgia that even as existentialists you can't get out of this, he probably said that statement. He probably did not mean it, but he said it, like, God, if we only had a God, maybe we could believe in that and we would not be in this terrible responsibility of having to figure things out for ourselves, I remember when I gave a lecture in art, I show 3 figures, Apollo Belvedere, which is the Greek sculpture Apollo, and David, Michelangelo's David, and Beethoven. And I said, look at particularly the faces between these 3. Apollo Belvedere was calm and serene, as if like nothing's going to bother him, in a very transcendental state almost. When you get to David, he had this very motivated, kind of almost a modernist attitude, really driven, determined to do things. Of course, he had the confidence, because probably a portrait of him when he was going against Goliath, like I said, he should be shaking in his sandals, right? But there was God standing behind him. Of course, he's going to be confident. What the hell is a giant to him when he has God standing behind him, right? When you look at Beethoven, you could see his expression. He's in anguish, trying to create something, right? In other words, Beethoven is a grown-up human being who's trying to figure it out. He doesn't have Yahweh backing him against the chaos of the world, And certainly he was an Apollo there. And so I think we're just thrown into this condition. It's not our fault. I mean, like maybe if we had something that we believe in and we don't question, like, oh, the eternal Tao, we don't question it. We can't figure out what the hell it is, but it seems to be.
Yeah, this is the in media res, right?
Yeah, right. So I think we're just caught in a condition and we're thrown into this situation and there's nothing we could do about it, except try to pretend to go to church. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, that's some Heidegger right there. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, first of all, I want to disagree with Phil. I don't think it's a terrible responsibility that we have here to try to figure things out. I think that's part of being human. And that's part of the challenge. And in fact, that is as the kids say, that is the jig. That's what it is. But then I want to go back to the text, Rick, if I may, because last week I was fascinated by this word habituation, and I could not figure out the follow-up that Kenneth Smith, the illustration that Kenneth Smith used with Kafka's America. And I did a fast read of it, and I still didn't get it, the context in which he was using that word. But the last sentence of that paragraph, where he says, a culture whose gospel is slavish, mediocriticism is conducting psychological class warfare against depth, spirit, philosophy, genius, aristocratic ethics, and authentic values, just as Nietzsche realized. Now, I get that. But the middle part with Kafka kind of lost me. I don't know if I didn't get the essence of the story. It's about this 17-year-old who got into trouble and then got shipped to America. And had some adventures. And I couldn't figure that out. So if you could explain that to me. And then the second point I want to make about character and class is something that Donald said. Donald said, well, you know, you have the royalties, you have the religious order, and all those people existing in a society, whether it was Greek, whether it was medieval, they kind of had their own structure. But there was one structure which I think came from the craftsmen, the guys who built the temples. And they were a very, very powerful force. And they had a character and a class that was all to themselves. And I think those societies have continued today into the male societies. I think we call them lodges now. I don't know if it's here in America, but certainly when I was growing up in a British-dominated society, a lodge is a very powerful thing, and it came from that. So those are the 2 points I wanted to make. And if you could comment on this group of tradesmen or craftsmen, who had a very, very, very powerful impact on the society in which they lived at the time. It was around the Middle Ages, the medieval time.
Those are great examples. Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I mean, you know, the relationship between these things is this idea that there's this feedback loop between your character and the way that you live your life. And Christopher Alexander talks about this in his books on architecture, where he says modern architects are obsessed with designing special things, special buildings for special occasions, or putting special touches on buildings, and then neglecting the basics. Like, how do the stairs work? How does the door work? How do the windows work? And he says, but the thing that they don't understand is that the most important parts of our life are the parts of our life that we live over and over and over every day, because those create the habits of our life, and the habits of our life create the patterns of our mind. And so if the windows and doors are laid out in a way that brings us ease and stimulates our mind without making us feel uncomfortable, then even if we can't explain why, we enjoy being in that space. We feel more alive there. His entire body of work, of writings about architecture, is about the ways that you can use or fail to use architectural design in ways that reinforce the habits of life of the people who have to live there, to help them to grow and become better versions of themselves. Whereas you go into some of these mid-20th century buildings that are designed to impress, to intimidate. Nazi architecture, this whole book's written on Nazi architecture. The giant, huge monoliths, the blocks designed to overpower individual people and make them feel unimportant. And, you know, you see some of those ideas captured in the building of high rises for poor people. You know, the project in the mid to late 20th century of making gigantic monolithic buildings, and all poor people would be shunted into them. And there's no sense of the importance of the individual anywhere in there. And so it's an oppressive place to live in. So this issue of habits of life and how they create a feedback loop with our character, and then the character, which is what's determining our fate, is what creates our range of options. So if the habits of life are narrowing our character, then we're ending up with fewer and fewer choices and feeling more and more a prisoner in our own lives. If the habits of life are cultivating the character to open up options and choices and help us see new possibilities, then we feel freer and freer and more alive over time as we habituate to the life that we're living. So what he's talking about here is, to be an artist or a poet or an author or a musician, you can't just, I mean, except in a very childish way, you can't just say, well, I just sat down and scrolled something and that makes me an artist, because you don't have any habits of life. You haven't spent years and decades doing the art and letting the art change your character until you are therefore forced through living the life of an artist to become an artist. There is this way in which you have to let the habits of life of the work change you into the kind of person who's well adapted to do that work. I mean, you must see that yourself, Sharon, in the who's going to make a good anesthesiologist and who's not going to make a good anesthesiologist. You know, one of the many different variables that goes into that is, do they actually practice anesthesiology, or did they just take a few classes and then think that they could just memorize what they learned there, and that's enough without practice. Because the people who do it learn through experience things that there's no other way to learn. And the experience reinforces the things that they did learn so that they become stronger in those areas than you could possibly be walking out of a class. There's this, again, this feedback loop. So he's talking here about how, you have to, if you want to be an artist, you have to be willing to make space in your life to practice the art. And doing that means you're having to give something up, because we all only get 24 hours a day. And it's the same to be a great anesthesiologist. What do you have to set aside to make the space for the practice of anesthesia so that you can develop the habits of life that create the feedback loop that grow you into being a great anesthesiologist? So he's talking here about this issue of sacrifice, that, ultimately in the choice to dedicate yourself to something, to trying to become great at something, there is an enormous amount of sacrifice, because you have to give other things up to create that room. And if you do that, it's going to change you at a fundamental level over time. The person who has practiced anesthesiology their entire life is a different kind of person late in life than somebody who gave everything up to do something completely different, like to become a musician. They have grown in different directions. And that growth in part involves the transformation of character. Now, what he's saying is that in the ancient world, this was widely recognized. Heraclitus has fragments, for example, that talk about this. Well, we don't have much by Heraclitus, but in that little, even there, he makes a point of, if you keep working at something over time, it changes you, and you start to become ruled by the thing that you're doing. And so you change. And when he's saying this, he's not saying something that was his unique insight that nobody else has. This was widespread understanding in the Greek world. A sculptor is going to develop a different kind of personality from a trader who runs ships across the Mediterranean. They're going to grow into different people. But we don't believe that in modernity. We think people are infinite potential and infinitely adaptable, and at any time, anybody can be anything. Right? We are not willing to acknowledge the sacrifice and the investment of time that's involved. And that the consequence of doing that is that we become different species psychologically of people from each other. We're related, but the differences are significant. Those differences used to be widely acknowledged, but in modernity, they're not. We're sort of, you see it as well. You can see it in evolutionary pop culture versions of evolutionary theory. We say, and this is not backed by science. Science doesn't agree with this stuff, but widely we say, if one species dies out, it must be a failure. And if another species spreads, it must be a success. And that the most successful species are the most adaptable species, because they can adapt to every. You hear this all the time. You read articles all the time. People are always writing popular articles about evolution using this idiom, that the reason Homo sapiens has spread to every corner of the earth is because we're the best. And what makes us the best is that we're more adaptable than other species. This idea that you can have an infinitely malleable character, that you can become infinitely adaptable and just turn on a dime to do anything at a moment's notice and be good at it without having to have given things up and specialized at all. This is a particularly modern form of, Kenneth Smith calls it a madness. He says it's crazy talk. It's like when teenagers tell you, I'm the strongest man in the world. And you look at the weedy little guy and go, that's sweet. Why don't you go lift some more weights, you carry some more bales and get back to me? It's like how in touch with our true potential are we? Or are we living a sort of hallucinatory dream in which we're like gods who could be infinitely capable at all things at all times? This is the Kafka's America issue that he's talking about. This idea that he goes to a place where everybody believes that anybody can be an artist without working for it, without sacrificing for it, without giving up a lot of things in order to be that artist and to spend the time becoming that artist. And without the acknowledgement that if you do those things, even if you do those things, you will become a different kind of person than somebody who hasn't done those things. Not just a label or a profession or a reputation, but at a level of character, you will have grown in a different direction than somebody who didn't sacrifice for art. So the whole thing this is doing here is talking about character and how as you work at a thing, it changes your character over time. And therefore, we're not equal, right? It's good that we're not equal. A guy who's a spectacular artist is not necessarily the guy you want as an architect who's designing your building so it won't fall over. These are two different skill sets. They require lives that you devote to these things and sacrifice to these things. And more importantly, not just the giving up of resources like time, but the shaping of your worldview and your character by doing the thing over and over. You have to become a different kind of person. Anyway, I saw you came off mute, Sharon. Go ahead.
Well. So what I was saying is, in the middle of the paragraph where he says, "In the modern culture of licentiousness," right? No shame accrues to the shallow pate. So what he's saying, this is all about development of character, and in the last sentence, how it impacts the culture. I get it now, but I just didn't get the 17-year-old in the book.
I'm helping. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if somebody walks in off the street into the hospital and says, "I'm a brain surgeon. I've decided today that I'm a brain surgeon. Give me the patient. I'm going to cut his head open." You hope that there's some sense of alarm by the people around and that they're going to run in to intervene and say, "Oh no, take the scalpel away from Bobby. Bobby is not a surgeon, no matter what Bobby thinks." He's the wrong kind of person to be handing a scalpel and a patient to. It's not okay. And part of what he's underscoring, but he chooses the example of art here. And in modernity, art is sorry, Phil, it's an effete activity. It's considered optional. It's considered a decorative thing you use to make your life pretty if you have money to spend on such things. But it's not, and this is where we differ from the ancients, it's not considered essential to the survival of the human species. The ancients believed in mythos. They believed that properly constructed art is essential to the survival of the human species. They bet everything on the idea that with the right mythos and raising up, every Greek being raised with Homer, that they would grow up and learn some kind of shame about the idea of letting their ego run wild. They needed to see these stories of people on the plains of Troy whose egos ran wild, and they destroyed everything. Despite all their virtues, they wrecked everything. They wanted to teach that shame. So they thought that art, to convey this thing was the most crucial thing of all. And therefore, it is at least as important that someone have the character and life of an artist before they do art, as it is for someone to have the life and character of a brain surgeon before you hand them a scalpel and a patient. Right? To the ancients, those were equal. They were at least equally important, and maybe the art was more important. But the critique here that he's describing is that we've got a modern culture of licentiousness, which says anybody can do anything. And that means there's no special requirements to be an artist. You don't have to live the life of an artist. You don't have to sacrifice to be an artist. You don't have to develop the character of an artist. And that there's nothing at stake. So what if somebody decides that their art is spray painting orange cinder blocks? That's fine. What do we lose? Well, that's because we don't think art's important. We recognize what's at stake. Better. Sorry, go ahead, Sharon.
So this comes back to the power of the craftsman in the medieval times.
Yeah, exactly.
Who wielded quite a bit of power in society because they had taken time and energy to develop a level of expertise which was essential to all the building that went on over in Greece, all over Europe.
Yes. And the example you chose is brilliant. And it's a brilliant example because in the medieval world, supposedly we're supposed to be sacrificing everything for God. God's the highest value now. All other values have been subsumed under God. And so bringing people to God, helping them to overcome the many temptations that would lead them astray, and getting them pointing towards God was considered the single most important thing that you could do. So the development of this high art of the Gothic cathedral wasn't just seen. I mean, this is why Sharon, I'm loving your example. To the medievals, the art of creating a Gothic cathedral was not like decorating your house. It was like more important than life or death. This was playing for cosmic stakes of salvation or damnation. They had to get these buildings right to draw the people in to save their souls. And if they couldn't pull that off, everything was lost. I mean, everything. And so the artists had this incredibly high status, the people who could actually successfully do that, and because they had that status, they were allowed to develop their own professional culture that they wouldn't necessarily have been granted the freedom to develop if the church hadn't felt like we can't afford failure. If they have to develop their characters and their practices and their lifestyle in a specific way to guarantee that the cathedral doesn't fall down upon the worshipers, well, then it's worth it. They would make that sacrifice and say, fine, we're going to, our normally genocidal enforcement of orthodoxy of beliefs, we're willing to ease a little bit in the sake of these Masons, because without them, we can't have these churches that everything depends upon. And so they were willing to grant the importance of that character and that lifestyle, which is interesting because moderns think we're more free than the medievals. And yet we don't grant artists the level of respect that you just pointed out with your example, the medievals granted to the Masons. And of course, that the ancient world granted to their artists. It's a great example, Sharon. Thank you. Just right on the money. Phil, then Stephen, then Joe. Oh, wait, Joe hasn't spoken yet today. Let's do Joe first.
I mean, sometimes I just think about, it's our relationship with material objects. And I think that that's kind of what is at the heart of the problem here. And in the sense that what is kind of forming our habits now are nothing more than our desires. And our desire is not to necessarily, just to, be an engineer only because that's where you can get a job. Not be an engineer because you really want to build something, that you want to create value. And I think that that's one of the problems that, that we have is that it's being taught, one, how to manage our desires, which comes back to the idea of character, I think, and channel that energy towards creating value, and creating value and getting satisfaction out of the value, and not necessarily just because it's something that material that you're going to get out of it. And so, and this is, and the reason I say this is that all of this actually is related to our character and our character development. And the issue that I see is that we're almost the way we learn, the way we're educated, we're almost kind of cogs in a wheel, almost cogs in a machine. And it's a very mechanistic way, and we're not really kind of I'm sorry, I'm a little bit hoarse today. We're not necessarily, kind of focused on essentially we're not focused on I would say on our true selves. And we're not focused on asking ourselves those questions. And school doesn't teach us those things. And that's what modernity doesn't ask us. It's becomes very special. We've become very specialized, very industrialized. And I'm starting to think that part of the problem that we have is more industrialization than it is anything else. And now that we're kind of almost even moving away from industrialization to a certain degree, I think that character is going to be more important than ever before, because people are really having a crisis of meaning. So when we talk about now, how do people find meaning, right? And this is what I've said before, is that your beliefs, your intellectual self, has to reconcile itself with your actions. And people are losing faith in institutions and in religions, and in certain cases. And with that, something has to fill that gap. And I mean, I think that this is where a more holistic approach to education in general is essential, because it's a deep introspection that has to occur. And there, people say, well, people don't necessarily want to confront themselves or ask themselves those deep questions. There's really not going to be much of a choice. And I think that there's, and I'm not saying this well, it's just this basic, I don't, for me, it's this basic, I don't think you can necessarily just tell people to have this set of beliefs and it's going to be okay. That's what I'm trying to say, in a sense, that there's going to have to be something that actually is authentic for people. And that's where I don't think I think dogma can be very dangerous. Because I don't think people can be dogmatic and be authentic. And so I think, in a way, more than anything else, we have to be taught to really kind of question things as to why we're doing things in the first place. And how do you do that? I think you have to reimagine the way we actually educate, educational institutions in general. And that goes from universities all the way down to regular schools, to high schools and things along those lines. Anyway, I think it's just the way we engage with material objects. It's really one of the biggest problems that I see in modernity. And I do think that there's going to be a crisis of meaning forthcoming. Anyway, that was a long ramble for sorry about that. I'm doing two things at once here. Sorry,
It's quite all right.
all over the place there.
It's quite all right. Thanks, Joe. Yeah. This is one of the critiques of modernity that runs throughout this book, is the idea that there are many aspects of our culture that we take for granted because we're familiar with them. And as Hegel warns us, being familiar with something means you don't understand it. But to us, we imagine the opposite's true, that once we're familiar with it, we understand it. And therefore, we can stop looking any deeper to figure out what's going on. And Kenneth Smith's critique is many of these features are tumors. They're things that, medievals and ancients would have criticized as just wildly dangerous. And our assumption is, well, if they think that we're doing something wrong, then they're wrong. I'm not a poo-poo head, you're a poo-poo head. This is the level of sophistication we have about our, the way that other epochs would not necessarily approve of all the things we do. We say, well, you must just be stupid and misguided, and that's why you think that we're wrong. But many of these things don't stand up to examination. You scratch the surface and you realize, for example, our approach to education, that it's a privilege, it's a reward, and that it's expensive and we should only give it to the, to the deserving. This completely fails to understand, to recognize how expensive ignorance is, which the Greeks understood. They said, ignorance destroyed everything, literally everything we built. The best and the brightest wrecked it all out of their ignorance. And we can't afford that. This is strictly at a practical level, it's too expensive to treat ignorance as a natural, normal, healthy, sustainable condition for Homo sapiens. We need to educate people, not in terms of just sort of pouring, endless, details and facts into them. We need to educate people at the level of getting the basics right, and also enabling whatever arete they have to develop as much as possible. If we don't do those two things, then we're going to end up with people who are sabotaging society because they don't understand what a healthy society looks like. And so they undermine the very things that we need in order to survive. And as moderns, we don't get that. I mean, you look at the content of the tests that we expect our grade school kids to pass, and it's missing everything that matters. It's like, great, you can now do arithmetic and reading and writing, but you don't understand the Holocaust. You don't understand the Soviet gulags. You don't understand any of the basic challenges that we faced in the last several centuries, which means you're setting us up to do it again. Possibly worse this time, now that we have more technology. It's like, this is way too expensive. The price that we're going to be asked to pay for not teaching kids these things. The ancients would say that is way too high a price because you're paying everything.
Just really quick, if I may, really quickly, yeah. The thing is that I don't think we're taught to reconcile the internal contradictions, and then so somehow people then think, oh well, we'll just revert back to dogmatic beliefs of the world, and that'll take care of it. And it's like, that doesn't take care of it. That's not that. And so it actually, and people will say, well, it was okay for this short period of time. Yeah, and then it ends really badly because people aren't necessarily thinking about, well, I believe this, and then things aren't going the way I want them to, and then I'm just gonna, then it's, you're right. The cost of ignorance. It's the cost of not only ignorance in the sense of the external actions that we, the world, but internally. And so that you can't just, put a belief system in place and think that everything's going to be okay. That's as industrialized as an assembly line. And that's dangerous. And that comes with a lot of baggage. So it's like, oh, well, it's better if we have this type of education. Maybe it's not. I mean, it's like that's that's where it perverts the perspective, and it actually works against principles themselves. It works against this whole idea of principles, of falling back on why are you being educated in the first place? Why is this good? Why are these things? And this is the questioning that that we're talking about. So anyway, I really think and that's character, to link it back to the section.
Yeah.
Being able to reconcile our internal contradictions is related directly with our character.
That's right.
And those behaviors manifest themselves in very ugly ways. So anyway, thanks for letting me go twice. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe.
You see that? Just 1 second, Phil. That saying in the chat, if you think an education is expensive, try ignorance. That was a stick that my dad used because we had such sense and pride. We did not want to grow up to be ignorant, right? But then we didn't want to do all that hard work in school. And this was one of the things he said very, very often. In fact, that you felt guilty when you didn't abide by it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you both. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I tend to sit on the fence to a certain degree because quite often I think
Phil? You equate?
What? Yeah, that's right. quite often we think of contradictions. I like to think of a lot of contradictions are really paradoxes. In other words, it could go either way, or maybe both ways. It depends on how you exploit it. I'm going to bring up a case that about typography, which you love, Rick, and show it. I'll start out with saying that I think in 2000 they had a survey of the most important man, and I think it might have been Time magazine, but I wasn't sure. Uh, who was the most important man in the last century? If you're a Christian world, would of course be Christ. And so the second century, there's a lot of great men. I guess I should put women as well. But I remember my family, I came home for Christmas and they thought they asked me a tough question, who's the most important man in the last century, last 1,000 years? And I said, Gutenberg has got to be one that's in consideration. And they were surprised, it's like, Gutenberg, we never heard of Gutenberg. Like, how could he possibly be? Like, how do you know him? It's because I study typography, right? Now, here's the situation that's a paradox. Because what Gutenberg did was invent a mechanical reproduction of letter forms, okay? And that opened up a lot of possibilities, but it also did infringe on a certain aspect of I say, expression and art and even crafts to a certain degree. And one of the paradoxes that happened was that in the mechanical reproduction, the the uh, the Arabs were way ahead of the West in its learning, uh, even up to the Renaissance. They made experiments. They also think they actually taught. I think the letters that we now use, in to the Europeans, and but and they had an empire. It was like quite large, but if you take a look at the Arabic writing, is very curved and very flourished. It's like practically art in a way, right? And not only that, but many areas which sort of would be specialized, that their character would be a little different and so forth. And so when type came out, with the Roman letter, well, I should say the humanist letter, because you have the upper and lower case. You have essentially a limited amount of type that you carve, which is a very, very difficult process. I don't want to explain the whole process to you. But essentially you had a punch carved out of hard metal, and you punch it into a soft metal, and that form a matrix, which is a mole, a negative space, which you would then pour lead into, and you could pour as many repeatedly as yourself, and they pretty much are the same character, close to being exact as you can imagine. With the Arabs, they have so many characters and so difficult, they couldn't translate it into a mechanical reproduction. And that gave the West an advantage in terms of information, explosion of information. Because if you could imagine before that, if science or literature or anything else, you have a bunch of scribes writing down the thing, right? Not that it's not better, but that took a long time. Apparently, if you imagine it, one of those illuminated books probably would be equivalent to like a Ferrari today. So if you want to build a library of Ferraris, have a go at it, right? And and the problem with the mechanical reproduction that creates a repetition, and so on the one hand, it creates a habitual recognition of things. And on the one hand, in a sense, it consolidated what I would say a kind of linguistic order, which was in a spoken language, you have symbols and so forth, but now you have letters that, in a sense, made permanent. In fact, I think was mechanical reproduction that, in a sense, hardened language to a degree, so it's no longer as permeable and no longer as ambiguous, because even with Middle English, with Shakespeare time, some of the words are kind of ambiguous. And so you lost a bit of that sort of, how to say, ambiguity that, in a sense, regular speech might have. But that, of course, is captured by the fact, depending on the expression and everything else. On the one hand, it opened up a dimension that if you didn't have the mechanical letters and print in the printing press, well, most people would just be farmers, and they wouldn't be very educated. They might be mill workers. But now you could have, in a sense, textbooks. You could have mass education, and it begin that process. So that's a good. But on the other hand, you lost, in a sense, the subtlety that's in the craft. I mean, I taught that, and my nephew now teaches that, and he's also very much into typography, partly because of my influence, but mostly not. He's gone beyond me in a way, and he says, even in graphic designers don't appreciate the subtlety of typography, particularly text type, because now, of course, display type, big letters, powerful, hit you in the face, so to speak. And so, in a sense, now, even as a craftsman, you lost the subtlety of that. You just want to get the letter mechanically produced that's correct, pretty much. So you have this ambiguity. On the one hand, there's a loss in the craft, in the techne, so to speak, that portrays the beautiful letters. But on the other hand, you have a gain. I mean, if it wasn't for that, you wouldn't even have elementary school education. You will have to be very, very wealthy, in order to have your children be educated, because each one of them will need a private tutor, and a scribe to have a book. Well, as a matter of fact, in the Middle Ages, they had books. It was so rare that they bolted it to a desk. So that's a library. So you couldn't steal it, right? Well, imagine you go into a library. I think I'm going to steal a Ferrari. No problem. That ain't going to happen, right? So that's why you have to follow the text. You actually are right there looking at the thing, and then you go away, and you don't take it home. Certainly, there's no paperbacks in that sense.
Yeah.
So I think there's always a thing that you have to, in a sense, depending how you dedicate yourself, if you're going to am I going to be a really artistic typographer, or am I going to just do the craft, do the job, and get it done, right? Because you're not being paid, generally speaking, I guess, unless you are very high up in terms of choosing the right typefaces, kerning them in the right way, all that kind of stuff, to, in a sense, because particularly when the public, all they want to do is have the text. They can't distinguish the subtleties. They just want to have the text. And since the public actually don't distinguish between them, then, in a sense, you could get away with it, and all we need is expediency and speed. And what is left over is the text itself, in a sense, not the craftsmanship. So there's ambiguity. There's definitely a loss in mechanical reproduction. And I just want to add one more thing. Because of what Gutenberg did, he not only created the first information revolution, I mean, and it spread throughout Europe and then later on throughout the world, but because of the punch and the mole, particularly the mole, you actually had the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Most people don't make that connection.
Yeah.
Because the mole is when you make a big or whatever, you can make machine parts, and you fit that together. Now you have mechanical reproduction rather than, a craftsman trying to make a wheel. I mean,
Yeah.
could you imagine how expensive a Ferrari would be if you have to make every little piece with an artist? So there's a plus and there's a minus, and you have to like understand that, because without that, like I said, most of us would just be working in the mill, grinding grain, uh, you know, horticulturing the a plot of land so that the Lord could take part of it away from you. I mean, it opens up a certain dimension, and I think that might also be part of the whole reason why part of what might be considered a certain amount of equality, because we do have a sense that there ought to be an equality of dispensing education, and you can only have that if you have the text, you know. Even if the text is wrong, you at least have the text. So I think we have to be very careful that to not slam one for the other. And the same things now is happening in computers, I'm sure, And the children that don't have computers, and they're falling behind, It's like, so now how do you get that? So therefore you actually, when we abandon public education, that's where the problem is, But that doesn't mean that you can't distinguish, even if everybody have a textbook, that somebody might be more competent in math or some more competent in one skill versus another, But you give everybody a chance to arise to where they might be, rather than the fact that, everybody could do everything. There are very few people. There are very few people who could do everything.
Well,
I
there's
think
no
you are an extraordinary genius if you are, top notch. I mean, really top notch. Tippy top notch on more than
classic
one.
examples. Michael Jordan, right? He was amazing in basketball, and then he took up baseball. And was he amazing in baseball? No, he was not.
Yeah. So there'll be top notch in two things. That would be, exceptional.
Pretty high
Like that
achievement.
would be Newton, like in physics and mathematics. So that's a rare, rare being. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'll just draw your attention to a couple of things I posted. Star Trek Chess, which has one of those great moments when human rights are being defended. It's so sentimental, so emotional. And when I was a little kid, I actually believed it. And when we talk about Kafka, I just recently rewatched a film called District 9. Hopefully people have seen it.
No, it's on my list to watch. I know it's very good.
I've watched it again, and it's a really relevant film. It's taking Kafka's contents and just putting it in this story about, of course, in this case, the other of these aliens who the humans don't like sharing space with.
Right.
But I was going to say about the question of art, and this is my big question about. This comes to this big question about what they call the Enlightenment. And of course, there were the reactionaries very quickly against the Enlightenment. Most significant early reactionaries against the Enlightenment were the Romantics. Goethe, you have Hamann and Herder, who were these other figures I pointed out, who were trying to point out, hang on a second here, Enlightenment. and it actually comes down to Nietzsche as well. You see what preceded Nietzsche. Their warning is your enlightenment is shallow. It's superficial. This is what Nietzsche's warning. Oh, we modern atheists will just throw God out of the pot. Nietzsche goes, no, 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 no. These people have been living with this tradition for 2,000 years, and actually it had a lot of successes and a lot of great moments too. And you're just going to say, toss it out? What's wrong with you guys? Are you all there? It's Nietzsche's question. Anyway, coming to art, this is something I love, used to love ships. And I still do like ships a lot. So the history of ships and everything. And of course, you come to the 16th century where the magnificent gunships are being built. This is what the Europeans used to conquer the world. This organisation of building these, you know, complex vessels, which you had to have all the men organised and run around on. And it was an art that couldn't be readily duplicated by other peoples. Now, the thing in the 16th century, when they were building what for them were the absolute heights of technology at the time, these, you know, big wooden gun vessels, of course, we want to give it a nice bit of polish and have beautiful artwork along the entire length of it, you know, maybe lots of naked ladies with nice bosoms right along the length. And of course, the principle is, as with Back to the Future, you know, when Martin asks him, I mean, I know you need a car for your time machine, but why a sports car? Hey, if you're going to travel in time, you might as well travel in style. And of course, maybe these artistic types had the thought, well, if I'm going to go off the war and get killed, I might as well go down looking good. But then came, you know, this new Newtonian sort of world, this pragmatic world appeared at the end of the 16th century, the bean counter. He'd actually been there a bit earlier on, but there were less of them. Now the bean counters were taking over, and they said, look, from now on, we have classes of ship. You have the 100 gun ship, 90 gun, 80 gun, with the law of the excluded middle. There's no 75 gun ships anymore. The ship is within these classes. It does work well. It works well. And of course, they said, we're not going to waste money putting artwork from stem to stern. You can have a bit of artwork on the front of the ship and some artwork on the back, and that's it. No more wasting money on artwork. I was reading a book on the shipping of the time that the unemployed carvers end up doing a lot of nice artwork in the churches, which you can see at this time. So there's this tendency to categorize, this tendency to be pragmatic, and this underlies the Enlightenment and tends to get ignored. And of course, we get to the world of the popularists, where the ancient regimes are getting overthrown. And in the World War I, of course, we have the great disaster in European civilization of the World War. And during the World War, of course, we see what I regard as a downward trend in arts, when the guy gets the urinal and exhibits it and says that's art. Now this particular piece of urinal is very, very valuable stuff. And Lenin takes this up, and because art is bourgeoisie. No. They're the bad guys. They're the guys we're going to exterminate. It's the salt of the earth, the peasant, you know, doesn't bother with nonsense like all this refined bourgeois art. And of course, one of the major components of that was gold. Oh, gold's so bourgeois, we use as money. That's just so bourgeois. The revolution won't need that, which is a lie, actually. The thing that saved them was actually they had gold to export. And Lenin said, well, I know a good good role for all this gold. Let's coat the urinals with golds. So this is its efficiency. And of course, the hidden meaning there is what Lenin thought of bourgeois art. Yes, that's how we're going to treat it. And this seems to be a component in the modern world, is to trash culture. Because, you know, once we've burned it all down, yes, you know, there will come the revolution. Oh, there's all this old stuff. Oh, there's a church and there's a family and there's art and there's culture and there's all this big nonsense narrative. We don't need any of that. Let's just burn it all down and make a nice big empty plain upon which to write our idealistic truths. Well, as I say, be careful of what you wish for.
Yeah.
Because reality is just so much more complex than a few ideals. Really, there's a lot of stuff to be nutted out. But I thought you might be interested in that question, how the categorization comes in the early 17th century, and what is the connection between the Enlightenment and the Romantics object to something in the Enlightenment, perhaps quite rightfully. And I remember Goethe, it puzzled me for years, and they talk about the generalization, which is categorization, pigeonholing everything. Oh, you're this, you're that. Yeah. Goethe says, yeah, it works, but it leaves stuff out. So you always have to, you know, put a little sticky note. Yes, this categorization is very handy, but watch out, you're missing stuff. But look at the tragedy today. You know, 50 years ago, all the educators were getting together and said, no, don't go pigeonholing people. That's wicked. 50 years later, it's like all this, you know, dividing people into races, like you're a different species. So they've gone from saying pigeonholing was a bad idea to adopting one of the most, an even more extreme type of pigeonholing. Yeah, you can put somebody in a pigeonhole, but just remember, you're not God. That works, but it's not perfect. It's a generalization. So thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. Can you type into the chat? I know you've done it before. The names of those two critics of the Enlightenment, because I want to. We've talked about them before, but I want to read up on them this week. Take some time to peruse them, and I think it's intriguing, this whole issue of that, you know, the capitalist societies had their reason for trying to eliminate art as, you know, unnecessary expense, and then Lenin, who in theory is creating the revolution against capitalism that's supposed to replace it with a better world, ends up recapitulating the same critique of art, that it's not necessary and is in the way and bourgeois and all that. And what you just described with the cycle of, do we pigeonhole people or not pigeonhole people? This is this way in which Hegel and his successors argue that you can see the evidence of the zeitgeist. I mean, the evidence of the meaningful power of the epoch and its worldview is that even when people try to rebel against it and its fundamental premises, once they're given freedom to create what they want, mostly they recreate the same premises all over again. And they think in the process of doing so that they're revolting. Well, actually, you know, I mean, so you end up with Russia ending up a capitalist society today. And the arc of how that came to pass is mystifying unless we can acknowledge that the epoch has a power. The worldview has a power. It's like Kierkegaard said, a delusion is a state of mind in which the thing you most need to think in order to escape the delusion is the very thing that the delusion won't let you think. It protects itself against escape, so that the free quote unquote free exercise of your thinking and creativity results in the recreation of the very system that's imprisoning you. And this is the thing that most revolutionaries don't get, is that they think if they could just have a big orgasmic convulsion, violent or non-violent, pick your flavor. But if you just have this big, then afterwards everything would be fine. But they don't see that they already are carrying the seeds of the current order inside themselves, and that they'll just
Our
throw it right back.
our poster boy for that one is Pol Pot. I think he's one of the most excellent examples
Another
of how
classic
things
example.
go wrong.
Yeah. It's why we have to study these people. It's really important to study our failures and see how is it that people armed with, all kinds of intentions nevertheless recreate the very problems that they think that they're trying to undo. So a lot of these things don't make any sense. You just, if you believe that there's no such thing as a world, as an epoch with a worldview, a zeitgeist, if you think there isn't anything entrapping us, and that at any time we're infinitely malleable and adaptable and can just choose to go in another direction, then you're constantly left with just history is littered with conundrums that you can't explain. It's like all these people tried to go in a different direction and ended up going in the same direction. And this is supposed to be a coincidence? This is the free exercise of what? But if there's a zeitgeist at work, if the way that we think and envision the world is formatted by the cultures that share a whole bunch in common during a given epoch, then it would explain why when we walk away from Omelas to cite Ursula Le Guin, and we go to set up our new utopia, we recreate Omelas again. So we have this, we don't understand what it is that we're doing or what it is that we need to change. I get into these arguments with my dad sometimes. He and I have arguments about political history, and he wants it to be simple and economic. If we just replace the economy, everything will be better. But that's been tried dozens of times, and each time it took us right back to where we started. So anyway, so that's what he's trying to get at here. He's when he's in this paragraph, I'm about to call on Sharon, and she's going to take us back to the text. So I see the twinkle in her eye, so I'm going to take us back to the text now. It's like, so why art? Why, when he starts out talking about habituating ourselves to live and how this is our character is created through our life. Why then does he turn to art as the core issue? And it's because, I think Stephen summed it up nicely. Both the capitalists and the communists had what they thought were their own unique, distinctive, revolutionary reasons to dispense with meaningful art. And in each case, they thought that they were doing something special and couldn't recognize that they were doing the same thing, and that there must be some deeper reason underneath the reasons they consciously had for what they did. There must be some deeper, since those are directly opposite each other, there must be some deeper reason they have in common that explains why they would manifest the same behavior out of opposite impulses. I mean, this is the swordfish and the dolphin and ichthyosaur all over again, right? I mean, Lenin and the bean counters have arrived from the same pressures at the same results, and that's how the pressures are there. You can see it from the shared consequence.
There is a place for bean counting, though.
Oh yeah.
You got to remember that little sticky note. Watch out.
Right. And the fundamental question is, do you have a market, or is everything put inside of the market? Right? It's the difference between the man with the hammer and the man with the complete toolbox, right? Does everything have to be the same damn hammer? That's the distinction that we're dealing with here. So I'm going to go ahead and call on Sharon and then Phil. So go ahead, Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So you're right. I want to take us back to the text, because I think we're into the fourth paragraph of the section of this essay. And I am not getting that Kenneth Smith has adequately defined what character is yet. Right? But the last sentence of the paragraph that where we're on now, after you explained to me about the young man in Kafka's America, he concludes that a culture whose gospel is slavish mediocritism is conducting psychological class warfare against depth, spirit, philosophy, genius, aristocratic ethos, and authentic values, just as Nietzsche realized. And I want to pause here because I think today we're living quite a bit of that. You know, the lack of character in all our elected officials is really impacting those among us in the populace who can't think for themselves. And I don't know which of the philosophers said it, but said democracy is only an effective form of government if the people are informed.
That's Aristotle.
Aristotle. And we're talking about education. And one of the things that I notice here is the people, the ordinary citizens, are not informed. And so when you have leaders whose character is called into question, and I mean, it's both sides of the spectrum, then we have a lot of despair and chaos, which is what we're seeing. So I like that last sentence. Reputation, image is all, which is where we are. It's all about the image and all about your reputation. Art is swallowed whole by a culture that values nothing but extrinsics. And I kind of like that saying from Picasso, which I put in the chat, that says, the purpose of art is to wash the dust of life off our souls. And it really does. And I don't think the culture has an appreciation of art at all. Because the education system did not make accommodation for that. And I'm speaking from my own experience too. I did science and that was it.
Yes. Yes. And you know, there is a role, you know, I remember on NPR, All Things Considered, it must be 25 years ago, there was a program talking about when people are evaluating cities and the resources that cities need access to. She was saying they forget that one of the resources they need access to is trust, because we're not sure how to measure trust, right? So we don't measure it. We just say, well, no, they need water and they need electricity and they need so much highway, you know, throughput. But trust, that's like, what is that? That's some subjective thing. We don't put that on the list. And then she proceeded to say, here's what happens to cities when citizens stop trusting each other. And it basically is the complete decline, or all of urban decay is captured in this whole sense of people don't feel like it's worth it anymore to exert themselves on behalf of their neighbors because they don't trust them, they don't like them. And I'm struck by one of my favorite critiques of the fall of Rome. You know, talks about there's so many explanations for what must have caused Rome to fall, and the I can't remember who it is who wrote this, who said every single, you know, he listed all the major theories, says every one of these major theories has a flaw. And the flaw is that this thing that happened around the time of the end of Rome had already happened previously and not caused the end of Rome. Why? What the theorists are failing to explain is, why did it cause the end of Rome this time, but not previously when it happened? And they had no answer, right? They're just cherry picking explanations. And he says, when you look at all this stuff, the thing that strikes you is in every previous calamity that somebody had theorized, this is what caused the end of Rome. Every time it happened before the end of Rome, Rome rebuilt. Right? You could have a barbarian invasion, and they even sack Rome, and still afterwards the Romans would rebuild. The big difference is at the end of Rome, the calamities came and nobody rebuilt. He says that's the part that's missing. The most important part is there came a time in the Roman Empire when the calamities happened, people's response was, it's just not worth it to try this again. I don't believe in this anymore. It's not in order to create a thing and sustain a thing, people have to believe in it and trust it and care about it and be willing to sacrifice for it. And if you treat that trust as disposable, like you start conning your citizens, You start, send out governors of provinces in Rome, and instead of helping to govern, they're just looting and pillaging, and it turns into this, peculation. You reward your cronies by giving them a governorship, and then they rape and pillage the land until it's the next guy's turn to come and do it. When you do that, yeah, sure, you get the short-term benefits of the loyalty of this one dude, sort of, whose greed is now being expiated. But conversely, you're losing the trust of an entire province of people who, prior to that exploitation, believed that Rome was worth fighting for. But now Rome is synonymous with just this horrible condition of living, until the day comes when the barbarians push through the walls of Rome. The Roman Empire, they manage to penetrate into the Roman Empire, get control of a territory, and instead of rising up and casting them out, the population is like, it can't be as bad. Can't be as bad as the Roman governors were. Go ahead, Sharon. I see you got.
I like that because I somehow or other, I'm of the belief that civilizations don't usually die from external pressures; they die internally.
Yes.
Yes, and now I kind of think that's where we are.
Yes. Yeah, I was watching. I can't remember which. Oh, come on, who's the actor? It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy.
I
What's his
remember.
last name? The who's the main character in that?
Jimmy Stewart.
Jimmy Stewart. Thank you, James Stewart. And he's in another movie, a patriotic one about the Constitution and the United States, and it's an enjoyable movie. And
Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Mr. Smith Goes to
Goes to
Washington.
Washington. That's right. Yes.
And man, does he believe in America. I mean, you watch that movie, and even if you're a cynic and you're burned out and you've had it, you're like, you feel the stirring in your soul that there was this thing worth fighting for, this kind of freedom and self-government, and there was a glory to it. And this is something that's polluted by successive acts of corruption and in government, and the conning of the population over and over, making it harder and harder to get an education or buy a house or get healthcare. And people get worn down, and that rising to the heights of enthusiasm of Jimmy Stewart, of, you could burn all of this to the ground, and the very next day I'd start, putting it back together again. You can see in his character the spirit of regeneration, which is present in every living system that's healthy. But you can also see how the successive administrations conning the population over and over saps that trust and that spirit of effort, until you get people where, it's just like, this is too hard and it's too disappointing. And if it was all burned to the ground, I maybe have to start something else over. Not that, because somehow that got all corrupted. So art, one of the critical things about art, which is the reason why mythos was the all-important art form that it was to the ancients, is that you can love art in a way that you can't love a regulation. You know what I mean? You may need regulations to run your city, but you're rarely going to have people who adore regulations. But you tell the story of Achilles and Agamemnon squabbling over Briseis, in the tent on the plains of Troy. And the whole battle, the outcome of the war of Troy, is being determined by whether these guys can stop fighting each other or not. And people love that story. The Greeks loved that story. They could find their way to a commitment in and belief in and a desire for Greek civilization in that tug of war of wills that they could never find in a list of regulations. And what's wrong with the modern epoch is its insistence that the body is a machine and the mind is a computer, and the perfect civilization doesn't require any special humanity in people, but only that people obey the law, and that everything turn into a well-oiled machine with no grit, in the mill. You can't love that vision of a world. in which your only allowed aspiration is that you'll do what you're told and not cause trouble. That's not lovable. That's not something you can fight for. So when Lenin sabotages art and accuses it of being bourgeois, when the bean counters sabotage art and accuse it of being a luxury that we can't afford, an inefficiency, what they're both doing in common is exposing the Achilles heel of modernity, that as it grows and purifies itself and casts off its past, purges itself increasingly of its medievalisms and its ancientisms, what it turns out is left behind is this soulless, unlovable machine that people won't fight for, that people won't regenerate when the final crisis comes. I mean, you could sort of, I don't know when it'll happen. I don't know exactly what form it'll take. I doubt it'll be in my lifetime. I don't know. Capitalism could go for a long time, and it's not just the economy, but the whole world system could go for a long time. But at some point, every civilization faces an ultimate challenge, right? Just like a teenager can't imagine being sick and dying because they feel so healthy. They think they'll live forever by default. That's the problem with a civilization in its prime. The more successful it becomes, the more it forgets about its own inner mortality. And that there's going to come a time when it can't get what it wants through force and domination, but it can only get it if people love it and will take care of it. And if people love it and want to take care of it, then when those crises come, it can regenerate out of the crisis and rebuild itself. But if it has become hateful and disgusting and corrupt, or even just empty and soulless, then when that crisis comes, people won't rebuild. That's the Achilles heel. You can see it coming a mile away once you know to look for it. Phil, then Joe, then Stephen. Come off mute, Phil, and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it seems like, but that could be taken certainly back to the Greeks, that particular flaw, both in Plato and Aristotle. Because with Plato, when building the Republic, only the guardians are trained in what's right and wrong. And you have to censor the flaws to make sure that people only concentrate on the virtues of goodness, which means that at least the populace is incapable of self-criticism. And it seems like the guardians are incapable of self-criticism. Maybe the philosopher king is capable. I'm not so sure. And it seems like with Aristotle, so much attention is focused on arete, only the good thing. We're not going to study the octopus that have 20 legs because that's obviously a flaw. I mean, like, it's not worth studying. We just want to study the specimen that is the right specimen because that has got the telos in the right way. And so it seems to me that's carried over certainly into modernity because we have this adverse thing about turning away from any kind of criticism. Like, like right now they have don't teach, 1619 because like you're making the white man look bad. We don't want to hear that. I mean, like, these are the flaws that you want to bring up so that you could correct it. And I think that's a residual from the Greeks in that sense, and I think the poets did emphasize the flaws as well as the virtues. So that's argument about philosophy, is should in a sense rule over poetry. Then in a sense, it's a way of only looking at the bright side of the coin and not the dark side. Which means that I guess, although I would say that, like looking at the bright side to emphasize you climbing the virtuous ladder is good, but we know very damn well that there's enough within us, actually each of us, that we understand that things could go awry, in all times. And that's without, I guess you could excuse them to a degree that, in a sense, although they have the psyche, they didn't really have Freud, you know, like so much of this, the drives are driven by the subconscious, the unconscious, that's subliminally surfacing into consciousness. Maybe they believe a little too hard on consciousness itself. And so that all the drives were flawed by, and capitalism has taken advantage of that very well by saying, you know, focus on, luring them to their drives and then forget about thinking altogether because, because they're hooked, Get them on drugs. I mean, they're hooked. They have no way of thinking their way out of it. So I think that, I mean, I like the fact that you make this meetup called Mythos and Logos, because maybe philosophy has displays maybe mythos a little too much, in that sense. So because
Yeah.
the unconscious is, well, if it has a logic, it's a different kind of logic than the rational logic. So that's important to watch out. And I also believe that, I always believe that I'm certainly not a perfect being. There's many things I want to do that, that I know better not to do. And the way I sort of sidestep that to a certain degree is sublimation. I mean, yeah, redirect
Mhm.
something that would displace that, or at least you know minimize that, so that you could have another interest, because we have many interests, and I don't think if you hook on one thing, then that's a problem. Yeah, I seem to be hooked on Pepsi Cola. That's the problem. So, yeah, I think the scar should be exposed so it could air out. So let's put it that way. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the critical things that happens is in the early stage of a new epoch, everyone knows the new epoch's in trouble. It's just barely being born. And so, creative people being, engaging in the problems of the day and speaking openly about the problems and trying to come up with solutions is not just encouraged, it's needed. It's widely recognized as an essential revolutionary function of the new age. But the problem is, once the new age finds its footing and becomes powerful, then the temptation is strong to try to save yourself some trouble by just suppressing dissent and saying, if people wouldn't talk about that, just don't mention it, then everything's fine, right? I mean, I grew up in an abusive household. I know the function of suppressing open discussion and dissent has, and how it's a reflection of power at its height. Because you can't do that early on, right? The society's not even got footing yet. I mean, it needs everybody to be fixing things. But this transition naturally develops where the society starts becoming averse to criticism and suppressing it. And that changes its relationship to art and philosophy and all of these other heuristic activities that previously were focused on trying to diagnose the health of the system and identify where changes need to occur. The other thing that goes hand in hand with that is the way that at the beginning, all of the power rests with the old order, not the new order. The new order is poor. They're upstarts, and frequently that's why they're revolting. Is that all in the previous epoch, all the money has been centralized, and there's nothing for them now, and so they welcome questioning concentrations of power and wealth. They welcome disrupting the status quo, knowing that by doing so, they're also disrupting the flow of income to the old powers that they're trying to weaken. But once they succeed and the new epoch develops its own power and its own piles of money, then it starts being a lot less sanguine about people disrupting the status quo and messing with their flows of income. So they get this perverse incentive working on the powerful get this perverse incentive working on them during the peak period of an epoch where they really don't want change because the status quo is now working for them in a way it didn't before. And so now it's not just that they're uncomfortable with criticism of the way things are. They literally have an enormous amount at stake in stopping any change from happening. And that ossification, that directly corresponds to a failure to adapt to changing conditions, because the world's going to change around them, and now their culture is not going to change with it, because to change with it, they'd have to give up income, and they don't want to give up the income. So they hold it in a rigid form that grows increasingly out of sync with reality until you end up with maximal corruption and the next revolution. So there's this weird cycle, and the fate of art is strongly, it shifts and changes over the course of this Hegelian life cycle. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just, well, really quickly, one thing about a story that I heard, that somebody had told me, but I think it captures what we were talking about a little bit with accounting well, that there was a store owner and he had a very successful business, and he sends his kids to very good schools, and the kid, the son comes home and says, your accounting's a mess. It's terrible. It's this, and this, and it's all wrong. And he's like, and he says, you're doing everything wrong. And he's like, he says, but he said, and he said, what, you could be doing so much more. And he said, I sent all of you to school and I did all this. And I basically, he's created a lot of value. He created all the value in their lives. And he missed the point that he was actually providing value and staying in business in the first place. And the point being, his son, that is that it essentially, his son came home only thinking about it from one narrow perspective and not necessarily seeing, what his father had done in the first place. And that's what happens, is that you start to think the success or something comes from just one thing, and this is what defines you. So only looking at it. So you could say there's still an accounting that is concerned, but it's accounting on a level that's far beyond double book account, double, when you're doing just balancing a ledger. And that's and I think that's, it's a story where actually it makes a lot of sense, in the sense that, yeah, there is an accounting, but it's not an accounting as we think of it. It's an accounting that it's a much deeper level. It's an accounting of ourselves and what we produce and how we interact with others. And yes, financial accounting is part of that. And so, but it's this much of a, and that's where we can have this narrow perspective and kind of miss everything. And that's the difference between managing your character and just managing a checkbook.
Right.
The other part is that was just a side note with accounting. That is the idea that you had brought up about trust. And I think that that's essential. it's there's there's been a lot of experimentation where it says that the for trust, there's a very weak equilibrium, but but for distrust, there's a very strong, equilibrium in the sense that and so that you don't get it back. And so once you lose it, it just gets into this cycle where you essentially, and that's where if you lose faith in institutions and things just start to fall apart. And, it serves as a social lubricant for society in general. And in a way, all of that is to say it's related back to our character. In other words, that's essentially what it is. And whether, these now I understand these are institutions that they don't, they're not individuals. But, once their reputation or their compromised, so to speak, it's very hard to get back that trust, which actually enables us to function as a society. And I think, part of the problem is that it's our inability to really understand why we trust things in the first place and assess the whole. Because institutions make mistakes, but it's the inability to really spot and see as to why, okay, this mistake happened. Let's not just throw away everything. Or get out our pitchforks. Let's just understand the problem and then kind of, adapt, as you said a little bit earlier. And that's kind of adapting.
Yeah.
And adapting requires a certain level of understanding and nuance. And so, and that's where it, comes back to, obviously how we're educated and how we think about things. But all of these things that I'm talking about are not strictly intellectual. They're more focused on our character. And that's the whole point of the section, really. And so, when I think about these things, it's this is why, character and respecting the past, and that's part of kind of this may have been not ideal or done properly, but you don't throw away everything. And that's what sometimes we were talking about a little bit earlier. Modernity has a tendency to do.
Right.
And then they impose their own order that creates the same problem. And that comes back to the whole thing that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
All of it relates to character, though. It all relates to character, and essentially, I think that this is relates to not overvaluing something that I don't know, and it goes back to the mechanistic aspect of things. I don't want to go down that road, but not overvaluing our specialized skills and actually valuing what's really important. Things like trust, things like people, and our interactions with them. So, and the only way you get there is, you get there through the arts, and the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
I'm rambling a lot today.
It's okay.
I'm
We all are.
Yeah. Not you, but I definitely am. That's okay.
It must be the day. It's affecting us all, so don't worry about it.
Believe me, it's been a day.
Well, what's really interesting about what you said, when you cross that with the Hegelian Smithian take on character is this idea that we have our individual character, yes, but also when we interact with each other, like on these calls have a certain character as well. And it's caused by the way that our different characters combine through our interactions to create a meetup call that has a very distinctive feel and quality to it. You wouldn't necessarily confuse it with any other meetup call. See, and part of it is because so many of us are the same people coming back week after week and together developing our understanding that, you know, it makes it very different from an introductory meetup call, for example, because we have this shared understanding we've built up over two years that somebody just walking in off the street's not going to know what the hell we're talking about. But by the same token, it's also different from a long running call in which the people are constantly swapping in and out, because then the ingredients of the character of the call keep changing week to week. And so the call itself has no persistent character. It just sort of drifts and starts to recreate itself each week afresh with a new set of faces, and then falls apart as soon as the call's over. So this is one of the things that the Hegel's trying to systematize from the ancient Greeks, is this concept of organisms within organisms within organisms as the structure of the cosmos. So each of us partakes in at least 3 levels of character. There is our own character. There is the larger character that we are creating with others together, whether it's a city or a neighborhood or a meetup call. That's above us. That's the larger scale that we're creating. And it is at least in part a reflection of our personal character, but it's mediated by everybody else's personal characters and how compatible are we and so on. But by the same token, we ourselves are also a creation of the components within us. You know, we're not, this is that heterogeneity he was talking about in the opening paragraph of section G, saying our own character is not, it's not like a monolithic God. It's more like a pantheon. We have a number of different inclinations within us, each of which is contributing to our character, and they sort of function like archai. And the archai rarely agree about everything. You know, they're pointing in different directions, and our character is the result of the polyntropy of, you know, all of them harnessed together, pulling in their own various ways to create this dynamic, complex dynamic system with a lot of different, you know, directions it wants to go in. So we are both an individual and a composite formed by components within us and components in larger composites. And our character matters in all 3 ways at the same time. It's, you know, each of these levels is equally important to where we stand. We're, again, this amphibious idea that we're in the middle between things, or to use Phil's term, equivocating, that we sort of, is it the one or is it the many? Are we individuals or are we a group? And the answer is, well, either of those is obeying the law of the excluded middle, and therefore is an inappropriate description of reality. We are both at the same time. We're social creatures and individuals, you know. So I mean, it's interesting stuff you're talking about here, and this is really going to what he's trying to get at here with these issues of, you know, art and expression, and how does a society value these things, and what does it say about its character, and also how do the habits, going back to the first sentence of this paragraph, how do the habits with which it treats art in turn alter the next generation of habits that are created from the resulting character of the society? There's a feedback loop at work in the society. If it reveres art and artists and really wants them to explore the human condition and to figure out what works and what doesn't work, then over time, that society's art is going to change that society in more responsive, adaptive ways to its problems than a society that just tries to stamp out any art that's inconvenient. Right? You can sort of see the differences. And they both have these feedback loops of character, just like anything else we do. That's why it's such a powerful model to say if the cosmos is not made up of things, but is made up of organisms, and every organism has its own character, and its habits of life that derive from its character in turn alter its character again, which then opens up the next round of choices that it has. This is a much richer model of the cosmos than it's just a machine full of parts and nothing means anything, which is the modern perspective. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Thank you.
I also, in a little session with a certain international organization, they had a guy there, Ukrainian, he'd emigrated to Australia, and so he's talking about the war, and I was looking at how people were reaching their determinations, and I mean, there's enormous criticism about Carlson, his interview with Putin, and of course Putin, who we've all decided in the West is purely a madman on the level of Hitler. I actually had to point that out in the meeting. I said, you're really scratching it when you're equating, as bad as Putin is, when you start equating him with Hitler. You really got to be careful with that one. But, you know, Putin starts off that meeting and everyone, what the hell's he going on? He spent half an hour talking about Russian history. I'm just amazed that people don't get it. This is something that guys like Putin are so aware of, that the West discounts the reality of, say, a place like Russia. It's different than the West, and the West discounts anything that's different from it as being inferior. And he's trying to point out, look, Russia started back in the 9th century and it's been going a long time and it's been big. Are you really sure that we're going into the darkness anytime soon? And, you know, they were going on the meeting. Of course, the Ukrainian fellow was very pro-Ukrainian. And, you know, reaching determinations, and, you know, they're thinking like, you know, when this is settled, we'll take all of Russia's nuclear weapons away. They shouldn't have nuclear weapons. And then one person was saying, you know, I think we can detach Siberia from Russia because there's a lot of valuable stuff there. And I'm thinking, well, as much as you dislike Putin, there's plenty of reasons for disliking his regime and, yes, condemning it. There's a huge amount of reasons. You're proving his point for being paranoid, because you guys, you're talking about destroying Russia, basically. That's your end goal. I mean, I remember the day when Russia was this, you know, Soviet Union was this giant entity which dominated Europe up to the Elbe or something. And we're all living in terror of the monstrous Soviet armies, and we weren't going to offend them or be impolite anytime soon. Soviet Union falls apart and the West encroaches and encroaches and encroaches. And, you know, even Putin says, can I join NATO? As a bit of a joke. Oh, that's silly. NATO is about getting rid of you. And I think this is where the West has failed, is your only position power. The only time you will ever respect Russia is when it has power. You're not going to respect Russia when it's weak. I realised, and I didn't use the word again, I didn't say this stuff to people. This is just what I was thinking. And I said, look, hundreds of thousands of people have become casualties in the course of this war. In the first year, when the Russian plan didn't go to plan and they were thrown back, that was a moment they could have sought a ceasefire and sought a way of talking through this. And the West was so arrogant, they thought their magic weapons would blow Russia away. And they were good, but not good enough, that they lost that opportunity. And now I said, look, there's been so much water under the bridge. There's been hundreds of thousands of casualties. Putin had to increase the level of autocracy. And I didn't say it, but the obvious thing is trust has gone out the window. And this is what's leading us to World War III. You're virtually telling Putin our only objective is to tear you apart when we get the power or reduce you to nothing. And what Putin is supposed to cooperate with that? Really? Oh, because we're right. You have to cooperate with us. We're right. We're a particular group of humans which has the last word on what is all good and holy. And yeah, this problem now extends to our society. There's been so much, it's like a lot of stuff going around is very malicious. It calls itself good, but it's actually very malicious. And it's destroying trust. Like, you know, when I go to the car mechanic, it was difficult enough trusting the average car mechanic 30 years ago. But things have reached a state now where, it's, do you go anywhere anymore? Do you trust anybody? What can you trust? But apparently there's a lot of people out there, or a lot of people in leadership, but are not really extolling that there's a problem there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, trust. it's for something that was just something I heard in the car driving to work, that program, on All Things Considered, had a huge impact on me, because ever since I just see the wisdom of what she said everywhere I look in the news. And it seems more intense when I study history. I see it everywhere. The societies where people believed in what they were trying to do are the ones that could survive the crises. And there's always going to be crises. It's only when people are at the height of their powers that they forget that there's going to be crises again. They start to think that they've got it made. They're too strong for a crisis. They're too in control. So as a result, they don't need people to love them anymore. They can treat people as badly as they want. And what are they going to do? You see it in the movie Star Wars. There's an exchange between Grand Moff Tarkin and Princess Leia on the deck of the Death Star when he's bragging about the power of the Empire. And she says to him, the harder you squeeze, the more systems are going to slip through your fingers. And it's true, and it's obviously true, otherwise there wouldn't be a rebellion at all. But he can't imagine it, because right now he's standing on the most powerful battle station ever created in the history of the universe. And so the idea of his own weakness and his need to be loved, which is a real need, he thinks he doesn't have that need anymore, because he thinks, now that I'm invulnerable, I can just exert my will to my heart's content and nobody can stop me. And that's, a few hours before he blows up. This is how it goes. And Greek tragedy after Greek tragedy warns us of this thing, right? There's so does history, event after event.
Like I said, you promised. You're entirely too trusting. We need to make an example.
Yes, that's what he says. He says, haha, I can violate your trust and nothing will ever blow back on me, shortly before he dies. Sharon, tell us what's on your mind.
So I want to come back to the text again.
Not Star Wars?
No. and I want to do the last sentence, because I really want us to do this last sentence.
Yeah, please.
Where
Let's
it said, reputation, image is all. Art is swallowed whole by a culture that values nothing but extrinsics. And we keep talking about trust. And this brings me to a point, to something that I think about a lot. What are the components of a character? And character here has got two entities, character of a society and character of the individual. And the two come together. And trust is an important component of it. And yes. I see trust like an egg. And once you've broken it, it's broken. And your only option is to eat scrambled egg. And that's the growth. Or a fried egg. But once you've broken it, it's just broken. And how you as the individual or the society lives with that depends on the caliber that you turn out to be. Right?
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot. There's one more one more character that I am one more component that I can't remember just now. But
Okay.
trust is very, 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 very essential. And I think that's where we are. Joe said we've lost trust in institutions. Yes, we have. And that's because of all the lying and the misrepresentations that's been given to us as citizens. And it's hard to come back from that.
Right. Right. Well, and this is where trust, being like an egg that can break, is the inside of the late stage of an epoch. In the late stage, when it's all powerful but corrupt, with no trust, it's just brittle. And if you break it, it stays broken. But in the early stages of an epoch, when it's fiercely about what it's resisting, what it's trying to replace, like trying to replace the divine right of kings and the corruption of the medieval church. At a time like that, the people who are revolting against that, they have an enormous amount of trust that has a resiliency to it. You know, 1500s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. There's an incredible health and resilience. It's like the will to live and heal of a child. You know, they get a cut and it heals and they go on. You know, this right here, I don't know if you can see it. This little scar right here on my arm is where a Doberman pinscher took a chunk out of my arm when I was a kid. I was a little kid, and you could see all the way to the bone. It was terrifying. Now, I got to be grateful I don't get an injury like that now, because my body at my age is not like it was when I was 11. When I was 11, it could go all the way to the bone and it could heal all the way right back up again, and I could be better than ever. But, you know, if that happens now, I'm more brittle than I was then. So this is why Hegel kind of echoes this Greek idea that there is a life cycle to epochs. And during the healthy phase, even if trust is violated, it can be healed. And the way it's healed is through the examination of what went wrong, the admission of faults, and the willingness to make amends and rebuild. And that willingness is easier during the early stages when there's not as much money at stake, right? And not as much reputation at stake. You're still new, and you're still united in your opposition to this evil old thing that you're trying to overcome. And so, yeah, you're going to make mistakes, and you know you are because you're weak, but you're also part of a culture of criticism and examination, because you're criticizing an examination, examining the existing status quo. And that bleeds into your own internal culture. During the early stages, you know, these kinds of revolutionary movements, and I'm not talking about 20th century revolutions, I'm talking about epoch revolutions, they're more able to rebuild trust because they have a culture of self-improvement and honesty that is necessary for them to have been able to critique the old order. It's
Can I
later.
just, yeah. The other thing I wanted to say
I was just going to say it's. Yeah, go ahead. Good.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, the other thing I wanted to say is, and again, this is personal and a collective culture. The other thing that's important is kindness, and kindness comes from strength. And I want to say something that Donald said. And I see cultures that are authoritative and are controlling people. One of the things they do is take from you, the people, the representation of your history. The Germans did that.
Yes.
And we are in a phase now where he's talking about teaching 1619. We're talking about teaching the Holocaust. When you take away a history from a people, you take away their sense of identification, and their sense of identification, with that comes your strength and your internal power. And when that goes, you are not kind and you're not strong.
Yeah.
And so again, we get right into chaos. I mean, I don't know which philosopher says that, but that's just my observation. When you take away the knowledge from a people about who they are, you weaken them considerably. And I can say for myself, I came up in a colonial culture, and I can tell you everything about the War of the Roses. I learned nothing about slavery. Slavery was taught at my dinner table by my father. right? And that's where, because he thought that was what was going to make his three daughters strong. They had to know who they are. You know, the War of the Roses was not going to help us. That was very British, you know, right? And so when I see that being replicated today, it's very disturbing because it takes away our strength and our ability to be kind and do unto others as we would have them do unto you. I think I've spoken enough for one day.
I mean, these issues that you're raising, they go right to the heart of this thing. You know, chaos versus cosmos. This is so fundamentally Greek, right? The cosmos, we've said before, it was the Greek fighting unit that it was called a cosmos, and they derived the concept of an integrated universe from the lived example of how much better fighters they were as an organized unit that worked together than the people they were conquering, who were fighting as, you know, strong individuals and not cohering. So they developed this concept of chaos versus cosmos, and they said the people that we're defeating, they don't have a cosmos, they only have a chaos. In battle, they have no cohesion, no ability to heal, they're not responsive to each other. They're not a larger organism. They're just a bunch of separate little organisms, and so they can be beaten. And so from that, they derive this whole cosmology of that's how the whole universe works. There is some kind of coordination that's happening so that we have we're able to create a larger character from our individual characters to get working together. And hand in hand with that was this concept of, why do they have this model? Because they know their own history. It's their own history of military conquest of the Hellenic Peninsula, and that they were able to do it because of their cosmos. That's what motivated them to continue working to develop themselves as a cosmos and to not let themselves fall apart into squabbling tribes again. They saw that what was at stake is if they all became a bunch of individuals squabbling with each other, or a bunch of factions squabbling with each other, then they would devolve from the successful cosmos into a chaos waiting for somebody else to conquer them. And that was because of their own history of conquest. They knew that was the case. So what you're describing, it's not even just a single Greek philosopher. It's like it runs throughout the entire ancient Greek culture. This obsession with cosmos versus chaos, and knowing your own history as being the key to being able to be a healthy, regenerative cosmos. It's great stuff, Sharon. And all three of those ideas are on my notation system that I'm working on developing, because I mean they're so important they're at the very core of the Greek concept of nature and culture and character. Thanks for bringing them up. We're coming up towards the end. Let's do Joe first and then Phil. So go ahead, Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So really quickly, one of those things that I think that are essential to trust and character and all of this is the ability to forgive. And the reason I say that is the ability to forgive is so important, is it is justice, right? It is justice, because when things are out of balance, you know, they're not fair. That's justice. Right. So when things are, you're so angry at something, and this comes back to the anger point that we were making earlier, that you're going to tear down the whole institution because you're so angry, because you're looking at something that somebody did wrong or an institution did wrong, and you're just trying to tear it down, and you don't allow your emotions to get the best of you. And from this the reason this is all related is because there's two aspects. There's the courage to admit you're wrong. That's one. And then there's the other aspect of the people have to be able to forgive. And then all of that is related to self-knowing, because nobody's perfect. And that's the journey. That's the journey that people have to go through. And so in a way, it's it's just introducing the nuances of character and in how, what it really entails. And I think that we are a very punitive culture now, and one of the things that I find to be most terrifying in politics today is not the dialogue as much as the willingness to punish somebody for doing something, making a mistake in certain cases, and actually making it impossible for them to admit they've made a mistake. And so I think that, that is essential to trust, because then you cover up if you do something wrong, because you think that the consequences are so horrible that I'm not going to admit that I'm wrong. So what I'm saying is that, in a way, it all starts with the self. You have to know, you have to have the courage to take on yourself. You have to have the knowledge of yourself to realize that you're not infallible. Then you have to have the ability to say, okay, well, now I know that that could be me that did that. I could be that Nazi. And you confront that. And that says, okay, well, then the willingness to punish, is not going to get you to where you want to go. And so that then you start to be able to forgive. And that's how you essentially, that's the cycle that's related to our character, is that you have to first realize your own faults, and this is where I always think of, when people have all the solutions to the world, not necessarily true. And there was a great article, I think, and I forget who replied to it. I said, what's wrong with the world today? And there was a paper, and there were a bunch of submissions from different authors at the time. It was in London. And one of them wrote back and said, I am. And that's it. I'm the problem. And that's the truth. Look at yourself first, then you'll understand how to forgive. Then people will admit when they're wrong, and then there'll be essentially the trust that is, that exists. Because I'm not going to trust somebody if they're not going to forgive me. I'm not going to trust the fact that I'm going to tell the truth, and truth is one of these higher level ideals that we're shooting for, which is related to character. I'm not going to tell the truth because I know you'll punish me so badly that. Anyway, that's the element. There's a lot of nuances to this. Really cool discussion. I just went on a little bit longer again. So sorry.
Can I just say something here? Because I gotta say this.
Sure.
When you look at societies, that have undergone this forgiveness, Rwanda, Germany. I don't know about Rwanda, but I know the German society after the Holocaust came to a much healthier place. And it is my opinion that we are still struggling with slavery.
Yeah.
Because we have never forgiven and we've never addressed it.
Yeah.
And we've just gone around the edges. And so that's really central to what you're saying. So I see it, because this is the way I see it. It's like you have a big wound infection, and it's leaking, and you keep putting a Band-Aid on it, and the pus keeps leaking out. That's our society. Thank you.
That's a great point. Nobody wants to admit that America was wrong. Like that, that this is what we were wrong. Like this is a really big, a lot.
We have never come to terms with it, never. And that's just the way it is. We live around the edges. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, and this goes right to that heart of trust, because if if there are punishments for telling the truth, then you've just created a perverse incentive for the society to lie to itself about what's real. And it's hard enough to figure out what's real even without deliberately lying to yourself. We unconsciously lie to ourselves all the time. It's a struggle to squeeze the truth out of our brains. But if we stack the deck against ourselves by punishing people for telling the truth, then the path into chaos is very fast after that. So it's part of why you've seen this movement. And I guess South Africa's done it, and Chile's done it, and a few other places where they call it truth and reconciliation, where as part of the process of ending a particularly heinous epoch, or not epoch, but period of their history, they make it safe for everybody to talk about what happened, including for the wrongdoers to come out and admit what they did, and without being punished for it. But because it's more important that we're all on the same page about reality, that is so important to a society that it trumps our desire. It trumps our knee-jerk desire to punish the guilty. So that's less important than the fact that at least we know what happened. And so, we have to admit that there are ways in which if you set up punishments for people for telling the truth, then of course they're going to lie, and now you're all screwed because you don't know what happened. Phil, come off mute and tell us final last words. You get the final last words today.
Yeah, I'll get to trust, but I want to start out with my art in this sense. When I started painting fallen angels, it had content, and I thought that it was really the relationship between art, philosophy, and I originally thought it was religion. I pulled back from that and said what's really in the middle is the human spirit. And I don't think of it as a triangle so much, maybe it is. I think of it as a tensional unity between art and philosophy, and the human spirit is the thing that mediates between the equivocation. And I must admit to Sharon that I do not have the degree of trust that she has. What I like about Plato is that he takes not only the society, but he drives it all the way down from nature to society to the individual. And if you and this is always in the possibility in a state of war. And if you drive it down to individual, then you are in some sense at war with yourself. And you have to constantly question yourself, who are you? Are you in the side of goodness or the side of evil? And I think, because I think that tension always exists within you. And once you are able to get that straightened out, if not straightened out, at least sort of in control, then in a sense, the individual and society could push upward. Because if it's not, it does not have the stability in the individual, which is the essence of what a being is, then you have to have a structure of society that somehow educate in some way. Oh, you have a bunch of psychiatrists, talk to these people and get them in balance with that relationship. The problem with something like China and with Confucius is that driving it down stops at the family, not in the individual. So it still stops down in a kind of authoritarian structure because of filial piety, which means the boss, the father, I guess the mother, and the first son and the second son will leave the daughters out of it. And so that structure, it's a hierarchical structure rather than driving all the way down to the base, which is the individual. I like that aspect about it because you have to hold yourself accountable for the structure that's above as well. And which means that the unity is built in this relationship, in the first, at the tension, the war between yourself. And then you begin to understand the war between individuals and the collective, and the war between society. And I think the flaw is at any point, those things could fall apart. And I think in that sense, the education is kind of important. You could accuse that of being a kind of indoctrination. And I kind of do accuse that of indoctrination. But you have to do it in a way that is open enough to let them learn in themselves of that structure. And I think, so, for instance, I did tell that story about, I once was desperate for a job, and the Morehouse College asked me to apply. I don't know how they ever heard of me in a way. So, and I thought about very hard. I decided not to apply because I did not trust myself that I would not inadvertently say something in the wrong way within a different culture that would, in a sense, be authoritative and be a kind of neo-colonial structure. So I forego that in that sense. And of course, Sharon said, "No, you would have loved it." And I answered like, "I'm not so sure." So in order to avoid the problem, that potential problem, and I don't think of myself as a bad human being, and I actually support a Black movement and all that, but I'm so inculcated in the, I might have to go see the plumber, inculcated in the sort of structure of Western civilization that I could be an additional problem. So you always have to question yourself and what you're going to do and how to supplement yourself in a situation that you might inadvertently, not consciously, but inadvertently steer things in the wrong way. And so you have to hold yourself responsible. You can't really blame it on others because, much of the fault, even if it's done to you in the wrong way, could be your doing. So I think that's why I do not live in this world of certainty. It's always a tensional thing that you fall back into question yourself and creating that tension between the ambiguity and the stasis.
That's what
And
we're going
I
to
think,
for today. We'll pick it up again next week.
So
okay.
can we go to the next paragraph, or do we have to
Yes.
finish this?
Well,
Yes, we
I have
finished
to
this
go
paragraph.
attend to the plumber, so you could go ahead.
Can I just
That's next
tell you
week.
something? Can I just tell you something, Phil? Well, I hope you've grown since your last application to Morehouse. My son went to Morehouse, and one of the things, he came home one semester and told me, he says, Mom, there's one white kid there, and he has a full scholarship. Now, what do you think? Right? So there you go. Right?
No, I believe you. No, I'm not saying I'm not trusting Morehouse. I said I didn't trust myself. Okay.
Yes, so I'm saying I hope you have grown.
Well, on this
Okay.
note, we'll see you
Well,
all next
thank you.
week.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.